So good morning, everyone. I'd like to talk about writing quality stack questions and to give you some hints of how to create robust questions for your courses. So the important topics that I will cover is how to keep your work tidy, naming questions, categories, and question banks. The requirements to create a basic stack question testing, that is part actually of how to create a working stack question, but it's a big topic on its own. That's why I wanted to highlight, and looking at students' responses and improving the potential response tree. So when you create your course in Moodle, this is what you see. You can add or remove topics and quizzes in a way that works better for your course. Try to give names that reflect the purpose and content of your quiz. Here is an example from our linear algebra course where we have all the weekly assessed quizzes gathered together. Now having names like, I don't know, just quiz 1, it may be very minimal because it doesn't give a lot of information of what the quiz is about. When students come back to revise a specific topic, they will need to look at the syllabus or the assessment mapping to identify its topic. So I think it's more helpful to give some more information of the topic of the quiz. This is another example from one of our courses. So next to the quiz, we have like a small note of what the quiz is about, like one is about intervals or errors. So that's a useful hint. So you must make an effort to keep your question bank tidy, otherwise you'll find yourself at a loss. You can access the categories from the left-hand side menu under the course administrator. So by clicking categories, you can create categories, subcategories where you can organize your questions. So this can be like week by week or by chapter, or whatever, or by topic, or whatever it makes sense to you. But if you have all your questions under one category, it will be very difficult to find them in the future. Another important aspect of keeping yourself organized is the question naming. The question name should be meaningful and consistent. It needs to contain information to identify the question in the future. Like for example, some of the question name, it could include the week, which question it is, and information of what the question is about, or the lecture you're using the question, or homework 2, question 3, what the question is about. Try to avoid names like that, just question 1. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to find what the question is like after a couple of months. You won't remember anything about it. So let's see the requirements for a basic working stack question. We need to have some minimal random variables. It's a good practice to comment the maxima code. You need to include word solution, the general feedback, which is reflecting the random variables. Consider likely mistakes and add specific feedback to test for this. I would say this is optional for a minimum working question. So you may not add this when you first build a stack question, and that question tests one correct and at least one incorrect variant for the test. So about the randomization. Randomizing question is one of the key features of stack, but be sensible with the randomization. A very sophisticated or a very complicated randomization is not always the best. Let's say you need to generate prime numbers for your question. It may be easier and probably not so time consuming, I don't know, to put 10, 15 prime numbers in a list and randomly pick one from the list, rather than try to use a function that returns back a prime number. Another aspect of randomization, do you really need all these random variants? Like 10, 20 different versions of a question look sensible for a quiz, but if you have, let's say, 100, may not all of them have the same difficulty. So this is something to consider when you're doing your randomization. And also you need to accept that there will be cases that you can't have many random variables. For example, when you have like trigonometry questions, how many angles have a nice trig number? Commenting maxima code, try to write comments when you're writing a non-trivial piece of maxima code, or when you make a not so obvious decision about your variables or about your randomization. You won't remember what you wrote after a few months. So when you revisit your question, you may don't know what the question is doing. And it's a good practice to do that, especially if you share questions with other users, which maybe don't know the way you build the question. So I just have a small example from one of our questions, and you can see we have some comments about the random variable k, which says that k needs to be larger than n, and some comments of what the functions are doing. So if you have a very trivial question, maybe you don't really need to have any comments at all, but that's fine. Work solution, or otherwise a general feedback, it needs to reflect on the random variables. You may need to define more variables, which will be part of the step-by-step solution. And please don't leave it for later. Don't write the work solution, I don't know, after a month after creating the question, because it will take much longer to write it. So it's best practice if you write the work solution as you build your question. So that's a very small example of a work solution. So we need to find the derivative of 3x minus 4x squared. Of course, 3 and 4 are random variables, so they will be different for each student. So apart from just having a variable that defines the function we want to differentiate and the variable that defines the correct answer, we may also need to have variables like one that gives you back the derivative of 3x and another variable that gives you back the derivative of 4x squared, or better say of a times x and b times x squared. Specific feedback. The specific feedback is associated with each input and each potential response tree. It gives hints on student-specific mistakes or student-specific answer. Probably is not the most important thing to include in the first run of your quiz. It becomes more important when you have considered likely mistakes or when you have reviewed what students got wrong after the first run of the quiz. So if your first questions just have, I don't know, full mark for correct answer and no mark for wrong answer, and they don't give any hints, it may be fine for the first run of your quiz. Question test and testing, that is a big topic on its own. So it is important to test questions to ensure they work correctly. Question tests provide an automated mechanism throughout which the author may establish with confidence what the potential response trees are processing the student's answer as expected. In this way, the teacher can record within the question itself how they expect the marking scheme to work for a variety of student answers. So let's see the testing just by having an example. So you can, so let's say we have a question. You save your question and you preview it so you can see it on a different window. If you have the authority to edit the question, then at the top right of the window, you can see the question test and deployed variants option. You follow this link and it opens a new window. This page manages both question tests and deployed variants. So initially you will have no tests and no deployed variants. At the bottom of this page, you can choose the add a test case. This opens a new page where you can create your test. So let's try to create a test that checks the correct answer. So if the student's answer, the answer 1, is the same as teacher's answer, then we expect the score in the potential response tree, we expect the score to be 1. We will have no penalty. And if we have like only one potential response tree, that should be follow the true branch. So after creating our test, we see that the score will be 1, the expected score should be 1, and we won't have any penalty. So this is a test case for the correct answer. So how many test cases do you need to have in your questions? So you need to have 1 test case for a correct response, 1 test case for a total incorrect answer, maybe some invalid responses, especially if you have a syntactically valid expressions. Adding a test case is useful to confirm that the potential problem is caused by the question. And then you need to leave the answer note null. And if you consider students' mistakes, you may need to have 1 example of each distinction you wish to make. And especially if you have added some specific feedback, you may want to test also these cases. So a Moodle administrator can run all of the question tests within a particular course, and it's very good to do it at least once per year to check all your questions in your course and to see if they pass all the test cases. So for the previous simple question, this is the test case of when the student puts a completely wrong answer. So the score will be 0 and the expected score will be 0, and you may want to have a penalty for the student for putting a wrong answer, especially if they will resubmit their answer later. And also this is a test case for an invalid expression. Like in the question we don't allow them to multiply the 2 matrices. Like they need to do all the math and put the final answer and not like type something, adding the 2 matrices or multiply them. So in that case, this is an invalid answer. So that's a test case for that. So after having creating your question, it's a good practice just to read it and see if the phrasing of the question is clear to the students, or will the students know how to input an answer? Maybe you want to put a syntax hint, a method that will help them. And will the validation help by telling the students, let's say if you have a question for significant figures, to tell them how many significant figures is expected? Like you don't want to penalize the students for this kind of technicality. So after having run your quizzes on the first go, you can review your students' answers in order to give better feedback. So now in Stack we have a new feature which is called Basic Question Use Report, which will help for this. So the example that I have here is a question with no random variables. I suppose it's easier to understand how the feature works. So the student needs to type as an answer which line has the fallacy. And you can see the student's answer, and almost 53% of them chose line 8, which is the correct one. And you can see some other possible answers that they put, like a good ratio, and 70% of them chose line 4, and then 11% of them chose line 5. So if you see like a big group of your students do the same mistake, you can use this information by adding more specific feedback to your questions. So when you have questions with random variables, I'll go back to the question with the 2 matrices. So you have this information for each variant. So maybe this is a bit more complicated. So for this question for variant 8, you can see that 86% of the students put the correct answer, and you have some information about people that put some wrong answers. So again, you can use this information to build your feedback. And I think that was me. I tried to cover a lot of stuff, and I don't know if I was out of time or not. I didn't keep any track of time.
Thanks, Konstantina. We do have some time for questions. If you'd like to put, if they're, they can either go in the chat, but better in the forum, perhaps. Konstantina, thank you. The work you're doing it's not as glamorous as conceptual learning or some of the other things that we might do, but it's so important. We're all in this for the long game, and keeping your house tidy, creating quality questions, testing them and improving them is such important work to make sure that we're really doing the best job we can. I would really encourage people to take what you've said seriously, and some of that is hard-won knowledge.
Yes, it is.
from losing questions and struggling to remember what you wrote in your code and all these other things that we all do. Okay, so let me have a quick look at the, I'm going to have to just quick look at the forums and see what's going on.
There's a question here from Thomas for you, Konstantina. Goes,
Thanks.
how exactly does the null answer node work? What has to happen in the PRT to reach that? In the example of the matrix multiplication, if the calculations are not allowed, can that not be caught at validation stage?
Yes, so if it's not allowed, the students won't be able to submit their answer, but you also want to verify that this is actually the case and that it will not marked in a different way. So you want to make sure from with the test case that it will be as an invalid answer and it won't get marked at all. So maybe in a trivial question like that, you don't really need to have it, but there are some special cases that it may be important to have an invalid test case to test that things work okay or in the way you like them to work.
Okay, so the null answer node means exactly that the error is caught at the validation stage.
Yes.
Is that right? Okay.
Thanks, Konstantina. Jacques, have you got a question about randomization?
Yes, I do. So what I don't quite understand is randomization. I mean, so you generate, well, you put your random numbers. So in principle, it generates a very vast series of questions. But is it typically used to generate those beforehand using this deployment feature and then select 9 of those questions and then use them for the students always? I mean, is that the best? Is that the way it works? And is it the best way to?
Yes, so I should have had one more slide of having some deployed variants. So let's say you have a very trivial question, like find the integral of ax squared. Okay, and this a, you can have like around, I don't know, 100 values of a. But when you go, I'll try to find the slide, at least you can see the top of it. That one. So at the beginning, it has no deployed variants. Then you can undeploy a specific amount of variants. Like, I don't know, you don't want all these 100 different values. You may want to deploy 10. So every time you run your quiz, it will randomly pick one of these 10 variants of your question, if that makes sense. So you deploy a specific amount of variants of your question, and these variants are the ones that the students will see.
So in other words, the question does not run the maxima code for randomization. It just goes and pick one of the variants you've generated earlier.
Yes.
And the advantage of that, Konstantina, why do we do that?
So otherwise the quiz will completely pick a random variant which you won't know and you won't be able to review it later. So by having this, I don't know, pre-generated random instances of the question, you can go and review them.
So the advice is to review each of them and never put in front of students a question which is truly random, I mean, which you haven't seen before.
So the other advantage of pre-generating random variants is that you test them in advance. So the students only see variants that we've tested, right? Do you mind if I share my screen, Konstantina? Because
No.
I've navigated to the I've navigated
to the stop
to the
share. Can you?
I've navigated to the this is the in the demonstration site. We have this trivial question. This is the link Konstantina has mentioned, and if we click on that, these are the versions the student will see, and you can just eyeball that they're all reasonably similar. And if we run all the tests on these, right?
Yeah, that takes a while.
It takes a while because we're running every test on every random version. Now I know that one of these is going to fail because I've set that up to fail, and you can see in a minute that there's one of these tests is failing. So what's gone wrong with this question? Okay, so these tests pass, it's marking the correct answer correctly, but one of these tests is failing. And so, you know, from year to year, we can now figure out, you know, why this test is failing and so on, and what's going wrong. But from year to year, this ability to make sure the questions work before the students see them and make sure they're still working the next year is absolutely invaluable. And it borrows from unit testing in software engineering. I should have done this years ago. Okay.
Okay, thanks.
I have another question from the forum. Martin asks, what is an efficient way to ask for an integer with minimum clicks from standard settings? I want to refuse any inline computation, just numbers as input.
Sorry, can you repeat it? Because I had an internet disruption.
Okay. What is an efficient way to ask for an integer with minimum clicks from standard settings? I want to refuse any inline computation, just numbers as input.
I'm not quite sure I can understand the question.
So maybe I can explain.
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, the question is if I have a stack question, usually a multi-part question where I just ask for the node number in a finite element model or like that, and or just an integer value. I want to ask for an integer value. And sometimes I find that the students input expressions like 3 times 4 or 3.
Oh, okay. So
like
you
that.
don't want to allow them to put this.
Exactly, and I do not want to use them some variables or whatever. And I found some ways how to do that, but they seem very complicated.
So
Right.
in the input to the share my screen, Chris, or you can go to one question, just go down.
No, you go for it, Konstantina.
Okay, I need to open, yes, I need to open stack question somewhere.
So I have described that also in the Stack forum and on the Moodle site.
All right, let's not answer that question, right, directly. But what I think we should say, because time is running out and it's nearly time for George to start, is are two things. The first one is there's an interesting decision to be made about when a number is a number, isn't it? You know, is 1 + 1, or you had 2 times 3? Is that really what we want, or do we actually just want the number? And we sometimes have to make these fine distinctions. So we'll certainly respond to that and tell you how to do it. The second thing is sometimes these questions, we just don't have the feature now because we just either haven't had time or no one's asked for it before. And features like that, which are very sensible, we really want that feature, then we'll just add it, right? I mean, this is an open source project, and we push the project forward by fulfilling these needs. And then the last thing on this topic, because it's just sprung to mind, is that we'll have to decide, I mean, are you going to allow a minus sign in here? And if you allow a minus sign, how are you going to distinguish between -6 and 10 take away 4, right? I mean, it's sort of,
yeah, I see.
It just becomes, you know, anyway. So what we'll do is we will resolve that properly, but you can see there are, you know, there are things to do there. It's not entirely trivial.
Yeah, sometimes you don't guess that are special needs. You think it's quite an ordinary thing.
I think it's a very sensible suggestion, right? I mean, we should support that. We want the students to give a number and not some arithmetical expression equivalent to the number.
But then the easiest way is just to add the forbidden word. Like you don't want to allow multiplication symbol. So in your input answers, if you open the input answer, you can see a whole list of stuff you can do. So somewhere it says forbidden words. So I try to share my screen.
But if you have a lot of them, you do spend quite some time to click all the parameters such that you get this, and it's quite a sort of dance you perform every time.
Sure.
You make
I get this completely. So there's this whole tension in Stack between what should be a feature, which is supported as part of the core, and what you need to do on a question by question basis. And speaking personally, I have a very low pain threshold. And if I find myself doing the same tedious thing on loads of questions, then that probably should be a feature that we add in the core. So I'm really grateful that you've raised that, because that sounds like a very sensible request that we would want to support centrally. That is the way the whole project has proceeded. So without getting completely bogged down in the technicality of that, because I will answer it on the Moodle forum.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But I'm grateful you've raised it here, because it does allow me to say a few things about how the whole project develops when people raise these needs and we decide to add that as a core feature.
Yeah, you encouraged us on Monday, so I just tried.
Yeah, great. Good. Let's move on to the second talk. Thank you so much, Konstantina. Virtual
You're
clap.
welcome.
I really appreciate you putting together that so carefully. That's really helpful.